The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Eleanor Whitmore approached the teller window, her worn leather cane tapping against the polished marble floor of Crown River Bank in downtown Chicago. The autumn chill had followed her inside, and she pulled her threadbare cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Her silver hair, styled simply at home, caught the harsh, institutional lighting as she fumbled with her weathered handbag. Behind the glass partition, a young man in a crisp navy suit barely glanced up from his computer screen. His name tag read, James Patterson, Financial Associate, and his manicured fingers danced across the keyboard with mechanical precision. The sleeves of his shirt were perfectly rolled, his tie knotted with military precision, and his dark hair held in place with what must have been expensive pomade. Eleanor cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, young man. I have a question about my account." The subtle tremor in her voice, barely audible above the bank's morning bustle, seemed to register with James as a sign of weakness rather than age. His eyes momentarily left the screen, scanning her appearance with the practiced indifference of someone who had categorized people within seconds of meeting them. The frayed edges of her sweater sleeves, the sensible orthopedic shoes that had seen better days, the handbag that looked like it belonged to a different decade, all of it confirmed his assumptions. "You'll need to speak with the assistant manager," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had decided that her problem wasn't worth his time. His fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard, each keystroke a small dismissal. Eleanor shuffled closer to the window, her arthritis making the movement more labored than it should have been. She placed a folded bank statement on the counter with trembling fingers. "I just wanted to ask about a $15 fee that was deducted from my savings account. I don't recall making any transfers." James finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over her with barely concealed impatience. His eyes lingered on her worn handbag, mentally calculating its worth and finding it wanting. "It's probably an inactivity fee," he said curtly. "Standard procedure. Maybe next time you should read the terms more carefully, ma'am." The word "ma'am" fell from his lips like a stone, heavy with condescension. Eleanor blinked, and for a moment, the years seemed to press, down on her shoulders like a physical weight. How many times had she been dismissed like this? How many times had someone looked at her grey hair and assumed incompetence? "Could I please see the branch manager then?" she asked, her voice maintaining its gentle quality despite the hurt. That flickered across her weathered features. "She's out. Come back another day," James replied, already turning his attention to his smartphone. The dismissal was complete, final, as if she had ceased to exist the moment he looked away. But Eleanor didn't move. The bank's morning crowd flowed around her like water around a stone, but she remained rooted to her spot. Slowly, with hands that showed only the slightest tremor, she reached into her purse. Past the worn wallet, past the reading glasses in their scratched case, past the small notepad where she kept her grocery lists, she found what she was looking for. A small black leather wallet, different from the others, came into view. From it, Eleanor extracted a keycard that very few people had ever seen. She placed it on the marble counter, with the same gentle care she might use to handle a butterfly's wing. "Actually, I'd like to speak with the Director of Operations, immediately." James scoffed, not even bothering to look at what she had placed before him. "That's not how this works. You can't just—" But then his eyes fell on the card. The words seemed to swim before his vision as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Eleanor Whitmore. Majority shareholder, Crown River Bank Corporation. The color drained from his face as if someone had opened a valve. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words that wouldn't come. The smartphone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering, onto his desk. Eleanor's transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her back straightened slightly, and though she still leaned on her cane, it seemed less for support and more for emphasis. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "I didn't want to embarrass anyone," she said softly, but each word was clear and precise. "But this has been happening for weeks. I've seen elderly clients get charged fees they don't understand. Last Tuesday, Mrs. Chen was refused a withdrawal because someone said she looked confused. Yesterday, Mr. Rodriguez was pressured into an annuity with a 30% penalty clause that he didn't understand. Eleanor paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the suddenly quiet area around the teller window. Other customers had begun to take notice, drawn by the young man's obvious distress and the elderly woman's unexpectedly commanding presence. "I came today as a customer," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Not as an owner. I wanted to understand what our clients experience when they walk through these doors." James stammered, his professional composure crumbling like sand. I was just following policy. Eleanor picked up her cane and stood straighter than she had in years. Her voice was no longer shaky, no longer tentative. It carried the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Your policy is called discrimination, Mr. Patterson. Your tone is called arrogance, and your behavior is called unethical. Do you know what I call it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. James couldn't meet her eyes. "Grounds for dismissal." Eleanor turned and walked past the cubicles toward the glass-walled office at the end of the branch. Each step was measured, deliberate. With every footfall, she was reclaiming dignity that had been stripped away by a world that too often sees age as synonymous with irrelevance. But how had this elderly woman, so easily dismissed moments before, come to own the very institution that had mistreated her? What possible path could have led from the humiliation at the teller window to this moment of quiet triumph? The secretary at the end office jumped to her feet, papers scattering from her desk in her haste. The nameplate read, "Sandra Morrison, Executive Assistant," and her eyes widened as she recognized the reclusive owner of the entire Crown River Corporation standing before her. "Ms. Whitmore, we weren't expecting—" Eleanor smiled, and it was the first genuine warmth she had shown since entering the bank. "That was rather the point, dear. I find that scheduled visits rarely show you what really happens in a place." Within minutes, Sandra had summoned the branch manager from whatever meeting had kept her away. Within an hour, Eleanor sat across from legal and compliance officers, her cane resting against the mahogany conference table as she detailed what she had witnessed. "This isn't just about one rude employee," Eleanor explained, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap. "It's about a culture that has forgotten that our older clients built this institution. They trusted us with their retirement savings, their social security deposits, their life's work, and we've repaid that trust with condescension and exploitation." The legal team exchanged nervous glances. One brave soul ventured, "Ma'am, we do have policies in place." "Policies written by young people who assume that age equals diminished capacity," Eleanor interrupted, her voice never rising but carrying unmistakable authority. "Policies that allow fees to be explained away as industry standard, instead of what they really are, predatory practices targeting those who built the very foundations of our success." By the end of the week, an internal audit had been launched across all 47 Crown River Bank branches. Mandatory retraining on elder respect and financial transparency would begin immediately. James Patterson's desk was cleared, his nameplate removed, his dismissal as quiet and final as his judgment of Eleanor had been. But Eleanor wasn't finished. The hurt she had felt, the recognition in the eyes of other elderly customers who had experienced similar dismissals, it had awakened something in her that had been dormant too long. She began what she privately called her listening tours, visiting different branches in disguise, not to spy or trap unsuspecting employees, but to understand the full scope of the problem she had uncovered. At the Lincoln Park branch, she watched a teller sigh audibly when an elderly man asked for help reading the fine print on a loan document. At the Michigan Avenue location, she witnessed a security guard follow an elderly woman around the lobby as if she were a potential threat, rather than a customer, but she also saw moments of kindness. Young employees who took extra time to explain procedures, who offered chairs to those who needed to wait, who spoke to elderly clients with genuine respect and patience. It was at the Wicker Park branch that Eleanor met Margaret Chen, a 78-year-old widow trying to access her late husband's account. Margaret's English wasn't perfect, and she spoke with an accent that grew thicker when she was nervous. I just need money for groceries, Margaret explained to the teller, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her identification. My card, it doesn't work. The young teller, barely old enough to drink, looked at Margaret with barely contained irritation. Ma'am, I need to see the death certificate again, and the probate papers. This is the third time you've been here about this. Eleanor, sitting nearby and pretending to read a banking brochure, watched Margaret's face crumble. The woman reached into her purse, pulling out documents that had clearly been handled many times, their edges worn from repeated folding and unfolding. I have them, Margaret whispered. Right here. Same papers as before. Look, Mrs. What was it again? I can't just give you access because you're crying, the teller said, exasperation clear in his voice. These processes exist for a reason. Eleanor rose from her chair. Her cane tapped against the floor as she approached the window, and she cleared her throat softly. Excuse me, she said, her voice gentle but clear. I couldn't help but overhear. Mrs. Chen, was it? I'm Eleanor. I've been coming to this branch for years. She turned to the teller, her eyes kind but firm. Young man, I wonder if you might consider that Mrs. Chen isn't asking for anything unusual. She's asking for access to money that is rightfully hers, money she needs to eat. Perhaps we could approach this with a bit more patience. The teller looked between Eleanor and Margaret, suddenly uncertain. There was something about Eleanor's demeanor, the way she carried herself despite her age, that made him reconsider his approach. I suppose I could call the branch manager, he offered reluctantly. That would be very kind, Eleanor replied. She turned to Margaret and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Why don't we sit down while we wait? I'd be happy to help you. Review your documents to make sure everything is in order. As they sat together on the uncomfortable lobby chairs, Margaret began to relax. Eleanor's presence, her obvious familiarity with banking procedures, her patient willingness to help, it all combined to ease the older woman's anxiety. You know these things? Margaret asked, gesturing to the documents. Eleanor smiled. I've had to deal with similar paperwork myself, dear. It's never as straightforward as it should be. What Margaret didn't know was that Eleanor had dealt with such paperwork not as a customer, but as someone who had helped design many of the bank's current procedures. She had seen the reasoning behind each form, each requirement, each safeguard, and she had also seen how those same safeguards could become barriers when applied without common sense or compassion. Have you ever experienced something like this? Or do you know someone who has? Eleanor asked Margaret quietly, but loud enough for others to hear. Share your thoughts in the comments below. The branch manager arrived 20 minutes later, apologizing profusely for the delay and the confusion. Within an hour, Margaret had access to her funds and a personal banker assigned to help her with any future needs. As Eleanor walked, Margaret, to the door, the older woman squeezed her hand. Thank you, I was ready to give up. Never give up, dear, Eleanor replied. Sometimes the system needs a little help to remember its humanity. After Margaret left, Eleanor remained in the lobby observing the afternoon flow of customers. She watched young professionals rush in and out, their transactions quick and efficient. She saw middle-aged couples discussing mortgage rates with loan officers, and she noticed how differently the staff treated different people. Another test case presented itself when Howard, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, approached a teller about a charge on his account. His service-connected disability affected his speech, making him slower to explain his concern. Eleanor watched the interaction carefully, noting the teller's body language, the slight impatience in her voice, the way she looked toward her colleagues as if seeking rescue from this difficult customer. This time Eleanor approached more directly. Good afternoon, she said, placing her identification card on the counter. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I believe you were helping my friend Howard with his account. The teller's eyes widened as she read the card. Word had spread through the Crown River network about the owner's surprise visits, her commitment to customer service, and her zero tolerance for discrimination. Yes, ma'am, the teller stammered. I was just... That is, Mr. Johnson was asking. About... Take your time, Howard, Eleanor said kindly, turning to the veteran. What seems to be the issue? With Eleanor's patient encouragement, Howard explained that he had been charged for a wire transfer he hadn't authorized. The teller, now on her best behavior, immediately began investigating. What they discovered was illuminating. The charge was indeed an error, a fee applied to the wrong account due to a clerical mistake. But it had taken Howard 3 visits to get anyone to take his complaint seriously. Previous staff had assumed that his speech difficulties indicated confusion rather than a legitimate concern. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for this oversight," Eleanor said formally, ensuring her words carried to other customers and staff. "Your service to our country entitles you to the very best service from this bank. We will not only reverse this charge, but also review your account for any other errors." She turned to the teller. "Please prepare a written summary of what happened here today. I want to ensure this type of error doesn't occur again." As Howard left the bank, his dignity restored and his problem solved, Eleanor reflected on the pattern she was seeing. Each incident wasn't just about one rude employee or one mistaken charge. They were symptoms of a larger issue, an institutional culture that had lost sight of the humanity behind the transactions. Could one woman, even with all her authority and ownership, truly change a culture that had developed over decades? The challenge seemed overwhelming, but the faces of Margaret, Howard, and all the others gave her strength to continue. That evening, Eleanor sat in her modest apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The contradiction was not lost on her. A billionaire, living in a 2-bedroom apartment, choosing simplicity over ostentation. She opened her laptop, its screen reflecting off her reading glasses as she began to type. Her email to the board of directors was concise but powerful. "Effective immediately. We will be implementing a comprehensive customer service transformation. This is not a suggestion, it is a directive from the majority shareholder." The response was swift. Board members who had rarely interacted with Eleanor suddenly found themselves in emergency meetings, reviewing policies, examining customer complaints, and trying to understand how their reclusive owner had become so informed about day-to-day operations. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the bank's head of human resources, was the first to meet with Eleanor personally. She was a sharp woman, in her 50s, known for her no-nonsense approach to corporate culture. "Ms. Whitmore," she began carefully, "I understand your concerns, but implementing sweeping changes based on a few isolated incidents might be hasty." Eleanor held up a gentle hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Dr. Hawkins, let me share something with you. When I was 19 years old, I took a job as a bank clerk in Peoria. I worked 12-hour days, studied banking regulations at night, and slowly climbed from teller to assistant manager to loan officer." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Do you know what I learned in those decades? That every customer who walks through our doors is someone's parent, someone's grandparent, someone's life savings made tangible. When we dismiss them, we're not just losing a customer, we're failing a human being." Dr. Hawkins shifted in her chair, suddenly seeing the elderly woman before her, not as a disruption to established order, but as someone who had lived the very experience they were discussing. "The changes I'm proposing aren't hasty," Eleanor continued. "They're overdue and they start tomorrow." The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. Eleanor established what she called the Dignity Program, comprehensive training for all customer-facing employees focused on treating every client with respect, regardless of age, appearance, or account balance. She also created mystery shopper programs, specifically recruiting seniors to test the bank's service quality. The feedback was both enlightening and concerning. Many branches showed improvement, but some habits died hard. At the River North branch, Eleanor encountered Susan, a loan officer in her 30s, who had been with the bank for 8 years. Susan was reviewing a mortgage application with Robert and Helen, a couple in their early 70s, looking to downsize their home. "I'm not sure you'll qualify for this rate," Susan was saying, her tone suggesting the conversation was already over. "At your age, the bank considers you higher risk. Maybe you should consider something smaller, less expensive." Eleanor, sitting nearby and pretending to fill out a deposit slip, watched the couple's faces fall. Helen reached for Robert's hand, and Eleanor could see decades of marriage in that simple gesture: support, comfort, shared disappointment. "We've banked here for 40 years, Robert said quietly. "Never missed a payment, never had a problem. We're not asking for charity, just a fair rate. Susan sighed audibly. Look, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I'm just trying to be realistic. Your income is fixed, and honestly, at your age, the bank needs to protect itself. Eleanor had heard enough. She rose from her chair and approached the desk. Excuse me, she said politely. I couldn't help but overhear. Ms. Matthews. Susan. Matthews, and you are? Eleanor placed her identification on the desk. Eleanor Whitmore. I believe you're helping the Pattersons with their mortgage application. The recognition dawned slowly on Susan's face. Her confident demeanor cracked, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Ms. Whitmore, I was just explaining the bank's risk assessment procedures, and I appreciate that, Eleanor interrupted gently. But I'm curious about something. The Pattersons have been loyal customers for 40 years. They have excellent credit, stable income, and they're asking for a loan for a smaller home, which presumably means a lower risk for the bank. What exactly makes them higher risk than a 30-year-old with no banking history and a new job? Susan opened her mouth, but no words came. The logic was undeniable, and Eleanor had presented it without anger or accusation, making it impossible to argue against. I think we should review their application more carefully, Eleanor continued. And perhaps I should be part of that review. After all, I am rather interested in how the bank assesses risk these days. Within an hour, the Pattersons had been approved for the rate they originally requested. Susan Matthews found herself in mandatory retraining the following week, along with several other loan officers who had shown similar biases. But Eleanor wasn't content with just individual corrections. She knew that lasting change required systemic transformation. She began working with Patricia Hawkins and a team of consultants to redesign the bank's training programs, evaluation, criteria, and customer service standards. Every employee from teller to vice president will complete quarterly sensitivity training, Eleanor announced at a board meeting, not as punishment, but as education. We're going to become experts in serving all of our customers with equal dignity. Board member Charles Morrison raised his hand. Ms. Whitmore, with all due respect, this seems like a significant expense for what might be isolated issues. Eleanor fixed him with a steady gaze. Mr. Morrison, do you know what our customer retention rate is among clients over 65? He shifted uncomfortably. I would need to check the latest figures. That's 62%, Eleanor said quietly, compared to 88% for clients under 35. Do you know what the average account balance is for our older clients? Silence fell over the room. $38,000 more than our younger clients, she continued. These aren't just people we're failing, they're our most valuable customers. The expense of treating them properly is actually an investment in our most important asset. The numbers spoke louder than any moral argument could. Within weeks, the Dignity program had full board support and funding. Eleanor also established the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Financial Literacy, focusing specifically on educating seniors about their rights, understanding fees, and recognizing predatory practices. The foundation partnered with the AARP, community centers, and senior living facilities to provide free workshops. At the first workshop, held at the Chicago Senior Center, Eleanor stood before an audience of over 100 people, many using walkers or wheelchairs, all of them carrying the weight of years that society too often dismissed. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, she began, her voice clear and strong. 30 years ago, I was sitting exactly where you are, trying to understand why banks seem to speak a different language when talking to people our age. A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. They knew this feeling, this experience, of being made to feel small and ignorant by complex financial systems. Today I want to teach you how to demand the respect you deserve, Eleanor continued, not just as bank customers, but as people who built this country, who raised the generation now running these institutions, who deserve dignity in your golden years. The workshop covered everything from understanding fees to recognizing signs of financial abuse to knowing how to escalate complaints effectively. But more than information, Eleanor provided something many hadn't felt in a long time: validation. You have the right to understand every fee, she emphasized. You have the right to ask questions, You have the right to speak to a manager. And you have the right to be treated with the same respect as any other customer. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. But what if they act like we're bothering them? Eleanor smiled. Then you politely ask for their name, write it down, and ask to speak to someone else. Document everything. And remember, you're not bothering them. You're giving them the opportunity to do their job properly. The workshop ended with participants sharing their own stories. Tales of condescension, dismissal, and confusion created a tapestry of shared experience that was both heartbreaking and empowering. They realized they weren't alone in their struggles. As people left, many stopped to thank Eleanor personally. Walter, an 82-year-old retired teacher, gripped her hand firmly. "You've given us our power back," he said, tears in his eyes. "I haven't felt this confident about my finances in years." Maria, whose accent had been mocked by bank tellers, hugged Eleanor tightly. "Thank you for reminding us that we matter," she whispered. These individual moments of connection fueled Eleanor's determination. Over the following months, she established similar programs in 10 major cities, training local advocates to continue the work. But perhaps the most significant change came not from policies or programs, but from a shift in how Crown River Bank's employees saw their elderly customers. The combination of training, personal experiences, and Eleanor's visible commitment created a new culture. Back at the original branch where Eleanor's journey had begun, a transformation was evident. The new manager, Rebecca Chen, no relation to Margaret, had implemented respect protocols that went beyond basic politeness. When Eleanor visited unannounced 6 months after her initial confrontation, she observed a different world. Tellers took time to explain procedures, chairs were readily offered to those who needed them, and multiple employees spoke at least basic Spanish to better serve the diverse clientele. At one window, she watched a young teller named David patiently help an elderly man understand his Social Security deposit schedule. The older customer had asked the same question twice, and David answered both times with equal kindness and clarity. "Mr. Rodriguez, let me print this information out for you," David offered. "That way you can refer to it at home whenever you need to." The simple gesture, printing out a schedule that would cost the bank pennies, made an enormous difference to the customer. He smiled with genuine gratitude, his dignity intact. Eleanor approached David after Mr. Rodriguez left. "That was beautifully handled," she said. David looked up, recognizing her immediately. Like every Crown River employee, he knew the story of the owner who had transformed their culture. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore," he replied. "My grandmother banks with us now, and I think about how I'd want someone to treat her." This personalization, encouraging employees to see elderly customers as their own relatives, had been one of the most effective aspects of the new training program. Another significant victory came when Eleanor received a letter from James Patterson, the young man she had fired months earlier. "Dear Ms. Whitmore," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I certainly have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that losing my job at Crown River was the best thing that ever happened to me." He went on to explain how the experience had forced him to examine his own biases and prejudices. He had taken a job at a non-profit organization that helped seniors navigate financial systems, using his banking knowledge to advocate for the very people he had once dismissed. "I see my grandparents differently now," he wrote. "I see myself differently. Someday I hope I might have the chance to thank you in person, not for firing me, but for teaching me that respect isn't earned by age or appearance, but given because we are all human." Eleanor kept that letter in her desk drawer, pulling it out whenever she needed reminding that change was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. As the year progressed, Crown River Bank's customer satisfaction ratings among seniors rose dramatically. More importantly, the bank began to be recognized as a model for age-friendly financial services. Other institutions reached out, asking to learn from their transformation. Eleanor found herself speaking at banking conferences, sharing the story of how one moment of dismissal had led to a complete cultural revolution. But she always emphasized that the change hadn't come from above. It had come from employees at every level, choosing to see their customers as whole human beings. At one particularly large conference in New York, Eleanor was introduced as a banking revolutionary, a title that made her laugh. "I'm not a revolutionary," she said, adjusting the microphone at the podium. "I'm simply someone who got tired of being treated as less than human because of my age. If that makes me a revolutionary, then perhaps the banking industry needed a revolution." She paused, looking out at an audience of banking executives, many of whom were younger than her grandchildren would have been if she'd had them. "The question I want to leave you with today is this. When you go back to your institutions, will you wait for someone else to demand change? Or will you start tomorrow, today, making sure that every person who walks through your doors is treated with the dignity they deserve?" The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Eleanor wasn't thinking about applause. She was thinking about Margaret Chen, who now confidently managed her own accounts. About Howard, who had become an advocate for other veterans facing bureaucratic challenges. About all the people who had found their voice because someone had finally listened. After the conference, Eleanor returned to Chicago, to her modest apartment, to her quiet life. But quiet didn't mean inactive. She continued her foundation work, expanded the Dignity program to smaller community banks, and mentored young bankers who wanted to make a difference. On a crisp autumn day, 1 year after her confrontation with James Patterson, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca Chen, the branch manager, knocked on her apartment door with a smile and a folder in her hands. "Miss Whitmore, I have something to show you," Rebecca said, settling into Eleanor's living room. She opened the folder to reveal letters, hundreds of them, from customers sharing their experiences with Crown River Bank. Stories of respectful treatment, patient explanations, and dignified service filled page after page. One letter particularly caught Eleanor's attention. It was from a woman named Grace, age 89. "For the first time in years, I walked into a bank and felt welcome. The young man at the counter listened to my questions, answered them thoroughly, and never once made me feel foolish for asking. When I left, I felt respected, not just tolerated. That's a gift that can't be measured in dollars." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she read letter after letter. Each one represented a small victory, a moment when dignity had triumphed over dismissal. "There's more," Rebecca said softly. She pulled out a photograph of Crown River employees at a recent training session. Among them, prominently featured, was a young woman with a warm smile. "This is Maria Santos," Rebecca explained. "She's our newest teller, and she insisted on volunteering extra hours to help Spanish-speaking seniors with their banking. She says she learned from the best." The photograph showed Maria sitting beside an elderly couple, all three of them smiling as they reviewed account statements together. The connection between them was obvious, not just professional courtesy but genuine care. Eleanor studied the photograph for a long moment. "She learned from the best," she repeated softly. "But the best teachers were all of you, every employee, who chose to see our customers as people, not problems." Rebecca leaned forward. "Ms. Whitmore, there's something else. The board has approved funding for the Dignity program to be implemented nationwide in every Crown River branch. You did it. You actually changed an entire corporation." Eleanor set down the photograph and considered Rebecca's words. Had she changed a corporation? Perhaps. But more importantly, she had changed how thousands of people experienced one of life's necessary interactions, managing their money with dignity intact. A year later, Eleanor marked the second anniversary of her confrontation with James Patterson by doing something unexpected. She wrote a book, The Quiet Revolution: Finding Your Voice in an Ageist World, became a bestseller with all proceeds going to financial literacy programs for seniors. The book wasn't just about banking, it was about reclaiming dignity in every aspect of aging. Eleanor found herself traveling the country, speaking at senior centers, community colleges, and corporate events. But her favorite speaking engagements were at the Crown River branches themselves, where she would share the stage with employees who had embraced the new culture. At the Chicago branch, where it all began, Eleanor stood beside David, the young teller who had so patiently helped Mr. Rodriguez. David represents the best of this transformation, Eleanor told the gathered crowd of employees and customers. Not because he never made mistakes, but because he chose to learn from them. He chose to see every customer as worthy of his best effort. David, now promoted to assistant manager, spoke about his experience. When Ms. Whitmore first implemented the Dignity program, I thought it was just another corporate initiative. But it changed how I see my job, not just as someone who processes transactions, but as someone who can make people's days better or worse with every interaction. An elderly man in the audience raised his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, what advice would you give to seniors who are afraid to speak up when they're treated poorly? Eleanor smiled, recognizing the question as one she had wrestled with herself. Start small, she advised. Remember that you have rights, not just legally but morally. Document everything, and find allies, family members, friends, or advocates who can help you be heard. She paused, thinking of her own journey from that first humiliating encounter to this moment of triumph. Most importantly, remember that respect isn't something you earn by being young or wealthy or powerful. It's something you deserve simply by being human. After the event, Eleanor lingered in the branch, observing the afternoon flow of customers. The changes weren't just visible in policy or procedure, they were evident in the atmosphere itself. Conversations were unhurried, questions were welcomed, and every interaction carried an undertone of mutual respect. Mrs. Patterson, now in her mid-80s, approached the teller window with her monthly deposit. Eleanor recognized her from previous visits, but had never spoken to her directly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Patterson," the teller said warmly. "How can I help you today?" "Just my usual deposit, dear," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice soft but confident. "And I wanted to thank you for your patience with me last month when I couldn't remember my PIN." "That's what we're here for," the teller assured her. "It happens to everyone. No judgment at all." Eleanor watched the interaction with satisfaction. This was what change looked like. Not grand gestures or policy announcements, but hundreds of small moments where dignity was preserved and humanity was honored. As evening approached, Eleanor prepared to leave. At the door, she was stopped by a young woman carrying a briefing case and wearing a professional suit. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm Jennifer Walsh, the new district manager. I wanted to thank you personally." Eleanor tilted her head curiously. "Thank me? We haven't met before, have we?" "No, ma'am, but you changed my grandmother's experience with banking," Jennifer explained. "She used to dread coming to the bank, said they made her feel stupid for asking questions. Now she actually looks forward to her visits. She says the tellers remember her name and ask about her garden." A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. These ripple effects, the ways her actions had touched lives she'd never directly encountered, were perhaps the most meaningful outcomes of all. "Your grandmother sounds lovely," Eleanor said. "What's her name?" "Dorothy Walsh. She's 84 and has been banking with Crown River for 60 years. Eleanor made a mental note to look for Dorothy on future visits. Each customer had a story, and each story mattered. As she walked home along the lakefront, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The injustice she had experienced had been real and painful, but it had also been transformative, not just for her, but for thousands of others. In her apartment that evening, Eleanor sorted through the day's mail. Among the bills and newsletters was a hand-delivered envelope with her name written in careful script. Inside was a note from Margaret Chen, the woman Eleanor had helped during her early visits to the branches. "Dear Eleanor, I think of you every time I go to the bank. Last week, the teller asked about my granddaughter's college plans. He remembered from a conversation months ago. This is the respect you made possible. You didn't just change policies, you changed hearts. Forever grateful, Margaret." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in her journal, alongside dozens of others that had arrived over the past 2 years. Each letter was a testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept the way things are. But perhaps the most significant letter had come from James Patterson, the young banker who had started it all. 6 months ago, he had written to inform her that he was returning to banking, not to Crown River, but to a community bank that specifically served vulnerable populations. "You taught me that how we treat people in their moments of need defines Not just our character, but our institutions, he had written. I'm dedicating my career to making sure no one else experiences what you did that day. Eleanor had written back, expressing her belief in second chances and her pride in his transformation. They now corresponded regularly, and James had become one of the most effective advocates for elderly inclusive banking practices in his region. As Eleanor prepared for bed, she looked out at Lake Michigan, its waters reflecting the city lights, like scattered diamonds. Tomorrow she would visit another branch, attend another board meeting, or speak at another conference. The work of maintaining change was never finished. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that her single act of courage had created ripples that continued to spread outward, touching lives she would never know, creating a more dignified world, one interaction at a time. She thought of all the elderly people who would walk into Crown River branches tomorrow, next week, next year. They would be greeted with patience, treated with respect, and served with dignity. Not because policies required it, though they did, but because hundreds of employees had internalized the lesson that every customer deserved their best. Eleanor's story had become part of Crown River's official history. New employees learned about the day the owner visited as a customer and discovered how far short they were falling of their values. But more than a cautionary tale, it had become an inspiration, proof that one person's refusal to accept poor treatment could transform an entire institution. 3 years to the day after her confrontation with James Patterson, Eleanor received an unexpected honor. The American Bankers Association named her Advocate of the Year, recognizing her work in promoting dignified treatment of elderly customers across the industry. At the awards ceremony in Washington, D.C., Eleanor stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of banking executives. Instead of talking about policies or procedures, she told a different story. "I want to tell you about Dorothy Walsh," she began. "She's 84 years old, and she's been banking with Crown River for 60 years. She has arthritis that makes writing difficult. She sometimes forgets her PIN, and she needs extra time to read the fine print." Eleanor paused, letting the image settle in the audience's minds. Dorothy could be any of our customers. She could be your grandmother, your mother, or someday she could be you. The question isn't whether Dorothy deserves patience and respect despite her challenges. It's how we can create systems that support people like Dorothy so she can maintain her independence and dignity. She went on to share the story of Crown River's transformation, but more importantly, she shared the stories of customers whose lives had been affected. Margaret Chen, Howard the Veteran, Robert and Helen Patterson, each name represented not just a success story, but a human being whose basic dignity had been restored. Change is possible, Eleanor concluded, not just in policies or procedures, but in hearts and minds. It starts with seeing every customer, young or old, rich or poor, quick or slow, as deserving of your very best service. The standing ovation was immediate and prolonged, but Eleanor barely noticed. She was thinking of everyone who had been part of this journey, from the employees who had embraced change to the customers who had been brave enough to share their stories. After the ceremony, as Eleanor prepared to return to Chicago, she received a phone call that would mark another new beginning. It was from a consortium of senior living facilities, asking if she would consider developing a comprehensive financial advocacy program for their residents. "We need someone who understands both banking and the challenges our residents face," the caller explained. "Someone who has walked in their shoes, but also has the expertise to create real change." Eleanor accepted without hesitation. At 76, she was embarking on a new chapter, not as a retiree watching from the sidelines, but as an active advocate for a population that society too often undervalued. The program, which would operate in 12 states, aimed to provide financial education, advocacy services, and a network of qualified professionals committed to serving elderly clients with dignity and respect. On her first day as director of the new program, Eleanor walked into the offices in downtown Chicago. The space buzzed with activity. Young lawyers, financial planners, and social workers, all united by a common mission. At the morning meeting, Eleanor looked around the conference table at her team. "We're not here to make excuses for a system. That devalues age, she told them. We're here to change that system, one interaction at a time. Maria, a young attorney who specialized in elder law, raised her hand. Ms. Whitmore, what's our most important goal? Eleanor thought for a moment, remembering her own journey from humiliation to empowerment. Our most important goal is to ensure that no elderly person ever has to choose between their dignity and their financial needs. That when they walk into any institution, bank, law office, financial planning firm, they are seen first as a human being deserving of respect. The program grew rapidly. Within its first year, they had assisted over 10,000 seniors with everything from understanding complex financial products to advocating for fairer treatment in institutional settings. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect was the peer advocate training program. Eleanor realized that some of the most effective advocates were seniors themselves, people who had faced discrimination and chose to fight back. Walter, the retired teacher who had attended Eleanor's first workshop, became one of the program's most effective trainers. His personal experience with condescending bank tellers made him uniquely qualified to teach others how to demand respect. Remember, Walter would tell workshop participants, you've lived through decades that these young people can only read about in history books. You've raised families, built careers, and contributed to society. You don't need to apologize for existing, and you don't need to accept poor treatment. Eleanor often sat in on these training sessions, watching with pride as participants transformed from feeling invisible to becoming confident advocates for themselves and others. 5 years after her initial confrontation, Eleanor was invited back to the Crown River branch where it all began, not as a customer or an owner, but as a guest of honor at their anniversary celebration of the Dignity program. The branch looked different, lighter, more welcoming. Comfortable seating areas had been added, information was available in multiple languages, and a dedicated customer advocate was always available to help those who needed extra assistance. Rebecca Chen, now regional manager, introduced Eleanor to the gathered crowd of employees and customers. 5 years ago, a woman walked into this branch expecting nothing more than a simple answer to a simple question. Instead, she faced dismissal and disrespect. That woman could have complained and moved on. Instead, she chose to create lasting change. Eleanor took the microphone, looking out at faces that had become familiar over the years. I want to thank all of you, employees who embraced change, customers who shared their stories, advocates who joined the movement. But most importantly, I want to thank those who challenged the status quo, who refused to accept that poor treatment was inevitable. She gestured to a corner of the branch where a small plaque had been installed. It read, "In recognition of the dignity of every customer, young and old alike, this branch is committed to serving all with patience, respect, and honor." That plaque doesn't just commemorate what happened here, Eleanor continued. It represents a promise that in this place, every person who enters will be valued for who they are, not judged for how they appear. After the ceremony, Eleanor walked through the branch, observing the afternoon rush. At one window, she watched a teller help an elderly gentleman understand his medication insurance deduction. The conversation was unhurried, patient, and respectful. At another window, she observed a customer service representative explaining investment options to a middle-aged woman caring for her elderly mother. The representative had printed out simple summaries and highlighted the important points. These weren't grand gestures. They were the everyday actions of people who had internalized the lesson that every customer deserved their best. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she noticed a new employee, young, eager, and clearly nervous about meeting the famous owner. She approached him with a warm smile. "I'm Eleanor," she said simply. "What's your name?" "Marcus, ma'am. I just started last week. I've heard so much about you and the changes you made." Eleanor shook his hand warmly. "The changes weren't mine alone, Marcus. They belong to everyone who chose to treat customers with dignity. You're part of that legacy now." Marcus straightened with visible pride. "I promise I'll do my best to uphold that standard, ma'am." "I know you will," Eleanor replied. "And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying every day to see the person behind the transaction." As she left the branch that evening, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion, not because the work was finished, it never truly would be, but because she had seen proof. That change could be sustained. That dignity could become the norm rather than the exception. Later that evening, in her apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Eleanor received a phone call that would offer yet another opportunity to make a difference. It was from the mayor's office, asking if she would chair a citywide task force on age discrimination in public services. "We need someone with your experience to help ensure that all city services are accessible and respectful to our aging population," the aide explained. Eleanor accepted, knowing that this was simply the next chapter in an ongoing story. At 76, she wasn't winding down, she was expanding her impact. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was older than the one who had walked into Crown River Bank 5 years ago, but she was also stronger, more confident, and more determined. She had learned that age could be a source of power, not just vulnerability. That experience could be wielded like a sword against injustice, that one person's refusal to accept poor treatment could create waves of change that touched thousands of lives. Eleanor pulled out her journal and wrote her daily reflection. "Today, I was reminded that change is not a destination but a journey. Every interaction, every choice to treat someone with dignity, every refusal to accept the status quo, these are the building blocks of transformation. Tomorrow I will continue building." As she turned off the light, Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the people who would benefit from the changes she had set in motion. Margaret Chen, who now confidently managed her finances. Howard, who had become an advocate for veterans. James Patterson, who had transformed from discriminator to champion. But more than the individual stories, Eleanor thought about the cultural shift that had occurred. Crown River Bank was no longer just a financial institution. It had become a model for how businesses could serve all customers with dignity and respect. As she drifted off to sleep, Eleanor dreamed not of the past but of the future. A future where no elderly person would be dismissed because of their age, where respect was the standard rather than the exception, where every institution would see its older clients as valuable contributors rather than burdens to be tolerated. It was a future she had helped create, one conversation, one policy change, one transformed heart at a time. And tomorrow, she would wake up ready to continue that work, knowing that every small act of standing up for dignity had the power to change the world. The next morning brought news that would mark the beginning of Eleanor's 7th year as an advocate for elderly rights. Crown River Bank had been selected as a pilot program for a national initiative on age-inclusive banking. Other major banks wanted to learn from their transformation. Eleanor was asked to lead the consulting team that would help implement similar changes across the country. At 77, she was busier than she had been in her formal banking career, but she had never felt more fulfilled. "Change is contagious," she told a reporter who asked about the expanding program. "When people see that treating others with dignity actually improves business, creates loyalty and attracts customers, it becomes the obvious choice." But Eleanor knew the truth was more complex. Change required constant vigilance, continuous training, and the courage to address problems when they arose. It required people like David, the young teller who had grown into a manager and was now training new employees. It required advocates like Margaret and Howard, who spoke up when they saw others being mistreated. On a crisp autumn day, exactly 7 years after her initial encounter with James Patterson, Eleanor stood in the lobby of Crown River's newest branch. This one was different, designed from the ground up with accessibility and dignity in mind. The seating was comfortable and accessible, with grab bars for those who needed them. Information was available in large print, multiple languages, and audio format. A dedicated customer comfort specialist was always available to assist anyone who needed extra help. But what struck Eleanor most was the atmosphere. Conversations between tellers and customers were patient and respectful. No one seemed rushed or annoyed by questions. The staff genuinely seemed to enjoy helping people, regardless of their age or complexity of needs. A young woman approached. "Eleanor," it was Jennifer Walsh, the district manager whose grandmother had benefited from the changes. "Ms. Whitmore, there's someone I'd like you to meet." She introduced Eleanor to Anna, a new employee who had been hired specifically because of her passion for serving elderly customers. Anna had gotten her start as a volunteer with Eleanor's foundation and had impressed everyone with her dedication. "Ms. Whitmore," Anna said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "I wanted to thank you personally. Your programs helped my grandfather regain his confidence after a bad experience at another bank. He felt stupid and confused until he attended one of your workshops." Eleanor felt the familiar warmth that came from hearing these stories. "Where is your grandfather now?" "He's actually working with us," Anna smiled. "He volunteers as a peer counselor, helping other seniors navigate banking services. Says it's the most meaningful work he's done since retirement." This was perhaps the most satisfying development, seeing elderly people not just as beneficiaries of change, but as agents of it. The mentor program had paired seasoned bank customers with newcomers, creating a support network that went beyond formal policies. Eleanor spent the morning observing and interacting with customers and employees. She noticed how naturally dignity had been woven into the fabric of daily operations. It wasn't a special program anymore. It was simply how they did business. At noon, she was invited to join the staff lunch, a tradition that had developed over the years. Rebecca Chen, now overseeing multiple regions, gave updates on various initiatives. "Customer satisfaction among our 65-plus demographic is now at 94%, she reported. But more importantly, complaint resolution time is down to 24 hours, and we've had 0 discrimination complaints in the past 18 months. An older employee raised her hand. "Rebecca, what about the new challenges we're seeing? More customers, using technology but still needing human support." This was the next frontier Eleanor had been thinking about. As technology advanced, the risk of leaving elderly customers behind grew. But she had also seen remarkable innovations. Banks creating simple apps designed specifically for seniors, offering video chat support, and maintaining robust telephone banking services. We need to remember that technology should enhance human connection, not replace it, Eleanor said. Some customers will embrace digital banking, others will always prefer face-to-face service. Our job is to provide excellent support for both preferences. After lunch, Eleanor received an unexpected surprise. James Patterson entered the branch, looking professional and confident. He had driven down from Milwaukee, where he now managed community outreach for a credit union. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand, "I hope it's okay that I came. I wanted to thank you in person 7 years later." Eleanor shook his hand warmly. "James, I'm glad you came. I've followed your work. You've become quite the advocate. Yourself." He nodded, a mix of pride and humility on his face. "That confrontation with you changed my entire life trajectory. I realized that my attitude wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. And it opened my eyes to my own biases about aging, about worth, about who deserved respect." They sat together in the comfortable seating area Eleanor had insisted on for all Crown River branches. "Tell me about your credit union," she said. James's face lit up. "We specifically serve underserved populations, immigrants, seniors, people with disabilities. I've implemented many of the programs you pioneered. Our elderly members feel supported, not tolerated." Eleanor smiled. "Have you ever experienced or known someone who has faced similar treatment because of their age? Share your thoughts about how we can better support elderly customers in our communities." This question sparked a broader conversation that would continue for hours. James shared stories of his grandparents' experiences, his work with elderly clients, and his vision for truly inclusive financial services. As evening approached, Eleanor reflected on the full circle her journey had taken. The young man who had dismissed her with such callousness had become one of the most effective advocates for the very population he had once mistreated. That night, Eleanor attended a celebration dinner with Crown River's leadership team. It was meant to honor 7 years of the Dignity program, but Eleanor saw it as a celebration of human potential, the capacity to change, to grow, to choose empathy over indifference. During the dinner, Eleanor received a standing ovation when she rose to speak. 7 years ago, I walked into this bank as a customer and walked out as someone determined to create change. But the real change didn't come from my authority as an owner. It came from each of you choosing every day to treat people better. She paused, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar friends. The true measure of our success isn't in policies written or training sessions completed. It's in the smile of an 89-year-old woman who feels respected during her bank visit. It's in the confidence of a veteran who knows his questions will be answered with patience. It's in the knowledge that when anyone walks through our doors, they will be treated as a valued human being. The applause continued, but Eleanor was already thinking about tomorrow's challenges. There would always be new employees to train, new situations that tested their commitment to dignity, new ways to improve and adapt. A few weeks later, Eleanor received a letter that would mark another significant milestone. The Federal Banking Commission had selected Crown River as their model for a national campaign promoting age-friendly banking practices. The transformation of Crown River Bank serves as a blueprint for institutions nationwide, the letter read. We would like to partner with you to create a national standard for excellence in serving elderly customers. Eleanor accepted, knowing this would amplify the impact beyond even her most optimistic dreams. Within months, the Crown River Standard would become a certification program for banks across the country, with Eleanor as its primary architect and advocate. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Chicago City Council declared October 15th, the anniversary of Eleanor's first confrontation with James Patterson, as Dignity in Service Day, encouraging all businesses to examine how they treated their elderly customers. On the first Dignity in Service Day, Eleanor was invited to speak at City Hall. Standing at the podium where policy was made and futures were decided, she looked out at an audience that included business leaders, city officials, and dozens of elderly residents. Today is not just about banking, she began. It's about recognizing that how we treat our elders reflects our values as a society. Do we see aging as decline or as the accumulation of wisdom? Do we view older customers as burdens or as people deserving of our respect? She shared her story once more, but this time she focused not on the humiliation she had experienced, but on the transformation that followed. Change is possible in every industry, every institution, every interaction. It starts with choosing to see the person, not the stereotype. After her speech, Eleanor mingled with the audience, hearing stories from people who had experienced their own versions of age discrimination. A retired teacher talked about being patronized at a car dealership. A former engineer described feeling dismissed at a technology store. A grandmother shared how she had been made to feel invisible at a restaurant. But each story came with a counterpoint: businesses that had learned to value their elderly customers, employees who had been trained to be patient and respectful, institutions that had changed their policies to be more inclusive. Eleanor realized that her individual battle had become part of a larger movement. Across the country, people were demanding better treatment for elderly customers, students, patients, anyone who had been marginalized because of their age. As the event concluded, Eleanor was approached by a group of young activists who had been inspired by her story. Ms. Whitmore, one of them said, "We're starting a non-profit focused on ageism in the workplace. Would you consider being our advisor?" Eleanor smiled, remembering when she had thought her activism days were behind her. "I'd be honored," she replied. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, Eleanor opened her laptop and began typing her next blog post, a regular feature that thousands now followed. 7 Years of Dignity, Lessons from an Unexpected Revolution was the title. She wrote about the journey, the challenges, the victories, and the work that remained. But mostly, she wrote about hope. Change is not a moment, but a movement, she concluded. It's not about one policy or one program. It's about a fundamental shift in how we see and treat each other. Every interaction is an opportunity to affirm someone's dignity or diminish it. The choice is always ours. She published the post and watched as comments began to pour in from around the world. People shared their own stories of age discrimination and, more heartening, stories of businesses that had transformed their approach to elderly customers. Eleanor closed her laptop and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights of Chicago. Somewhere in those lights were the Crown River, branches where her revolution had begun. In other cities across the country, banks were implementing the Crown River Standard. In community centers and senior homes, people were learning to advocate for themselves. The ripples of change continued to spread, and Eleanor knew they would continue long after she was gone. That was perhaps the greatest victory of all, creating change that was sustainable, that would protect and dignify future generations of elderly Americans. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of a battle won, but of a war that was being fought with increasing success on multiple fronts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to stand up for dignity, new chances to prove that age was not a barrier to being treated with respect. She had learned that being dismissed because of her age had been painful, but it had also been a gift, a catalyst that had transformed not just her own life, but thousands of others. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest injustices provide the strongest motivation for creating justice. Eleanor smiled as she turned off the light. Tomorrow she would wake up ready to continue the work, knowing that every small act of demanding dignity had the power to change the world, one interaction at a time. 8 years after that first confrontation, Eleanor stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, speaking about ageism as a global human rights issue. Her work had transcended banking to become a broader movement for dignity and respect across all sectors of society. The story I want to share today began with a simple question about a $15 fee. Eleanor began, her voice clear and strong despite her 81 years. It ended with a transformation that has touched hundreds of thousands of lives and continues to spread around the world. The delegation listened intently as Eleanor shared not just her personal story, but the framework for change that had proved successful across industries and nations. The Crown River Standard had been adapted by banks in 12 countries, retailers were implementing age-friendly practices, and governments were beginning to recognize ageism as a form of discrimination requiring legislative attention. But Eleanor's most profound impact remained in the individual stories, the people who had found their voice, the businesses that had discovered dignity was good for profits, the employees who had learned that respect was not rationed but renewable. After the UN session, Eleanor returned to Chicago for one final visit to the Crown River branch where her journey began. The bank had installed a small memorial plaque where Eleanor had first stood that day 8 years ago. In honor of Eleanor Whitmore, who reminded us that respect is the currency of human dignity, a small group had gathered for the dedication, current and former employees, customers whose lives had been changed, advocates who had joined the movement. Rebecca Chen, now part of Crown River's national leadership, spoke first. 8 years. Ago, a brilliant woman walked into this bank, expecting simple courtesy, and received dismissive treatment. Instead of accepting it, she transformed it. Today, millions of elderly Americans experience dignified banking services because Eleanor Whitmore refused to be overlooked. When Eleanor rose to speak, she looked around at the faces gathered, young and old, diverse in background but united, in their commitment to human dignity. This plaque doesn't commemorate an ending, she said. It marks a beginning. Every day, each of you has the power to honor someone's dignity or diminish it. The choice is always yours, and the impact ripples far beyond what you can imagine. As the ceremony concluded, people approached Eleanor to share personal stories. A young teller talked about how the training had changed her entire approach to customer service. An elderly customer described how respected she now felt during every banking interaction. A manager explained how the dignity principles had improved, staff morale and customer loyalty. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a familiar figure approached, James Patterson, now in his 40s, and a respected leader in community banking. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "I brought someone I'd like you to meet." Behind him stood a teenage girl with James's eyes and smile. "This is my daughter, Elena," James said proudly. "She's named after you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she shook the young woman's hand. "Hello, Elena, what a beautiful name." The girl smiled, clearly awed to meet the person who had so influenced her father's life. "Dad tells me your story all the time?" about how one person can change everything by refusing to accept wrong as normal. Your father learned that lesson. Better than anyone, Eleanor replied, and now he's teaching others, including you. As the evening wound down, Eleanor found herself alone in the branch for a few moments. She stood where she had stood 8 years ago, remembering the humiliation, the anger, the determination that had followed. But now, instead of fluorescent lights humming overhead in cold indifference, the branch was filled with warm lighting, comfortable seating, and an atmosphere of genuine welcome. Information was available in large print and multiple languages. Staff moved with the unhurried confidence of people who enjoyed their work. Eleanor smiled, remembering her younger self, who had simply wanted a $15 fee, explained. That woman could never have imagined that her moment of frustration would become a global movement for dignity. As she prepared to leave the branch for the last time as an active advocate, she had announced her retirement from speaking and consulting. Eleanor looked once more at the plaque that bore her name. But she wasn't thinking about memorials or recognition. She was thinking about the future, about all the elderly people who would walk into banks, stores, offices, and hospitals tomorrow and be treated with the respect they deserved, about the employees who would see past age to recognize human worth, about the institutional changes that would continue to spread and evolve. Outside, the Chicago evening was crisp and clear. Eleanor walked slowly to her car, her cane steady on the pavement. At 81, she was ready to step back from public advocacy, but she knew the movement would continue without her. As she drove home, Eleanor passed Crown River branches across the city, each one a testament to the power of refusing to accept indignity. In each branch, people were being served with respect, regardless of their age, appearance, or account balance. That night, Eleanor wrote her final blog post. When I was 71 and invisible, a farewell from the front lines. 8 years ago, I walked into a bank and discovered that I had become invisible, not because I was actually unseen, but because I had been deemed unworthy of respect because of my age. That day changed everything, not just for me, but for millions of others. Today, I'm stepping back from active advocacy at age 81, but I'm not retiring from hope. The movement we started, the insistence that dignity is not a privilege but a right, continues to grow and strengthen. I leave you with this. Every day you have countless opportunities to recognize the humanity in others. When you see an elderly person struggling with technology, offer patient help, not sighs of frustration. When someone moves slowly or needs questions repeated, remember that they have lived through decades you can only imagine. Respect is not something people must earn through youth or vigor. It's something they deserve simply by being human. The revolution continues, one interaction at a time. The blog post went viral within hours, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Comments poured in from around the world. Stories of transformation, promises to do better, expressions of gratitude for a movement that had changed lives. But Eleanor didn't see most of the responses. She had closed her laptop, turned off the lights and settled into bed, content in the knowledge that she had used her experience of discrimination to create a more dignified world for others. The work would continue. In banks across America and beyond, the Crown River Standard would keep evolving. In community centers, advocacy groups would continue to teach elderly people to demand respect. In boardrooms, executives would continue to learn that dignity was not just morally right, but economically smart. And somewhere in a small bank branch, a young employee would choose patience over dismissal, understanding over frustration, dignity over indifference. They might never know that their choice was part of a larger movement, but it would matter nonetheless. Eleanor slept peacefully that night, surrounded by letters, awards, and photographs, documenting a journey that had begun with humiliation and culminated in transformation. But more than any accolade, she treasured the knowledge that countless elderly Americans would wake up tomorrow in a world slightly more respectful of their dignity. The quiet revolution had achieved something remarkable. It had proven that individual acts of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept injustice could indeed change the world. Not through grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but through the accumulation of millions of moments where someone chose dignity over dismissal, patience over prejudice, respect over rejection. Eleanor Whitmore had walked into Crown River Bank as a dismissed customer and emerged as a catalyst for global change. Her legacy lived not in plaques or ceremonies, but in every elderly person who could walk into any institution and expect and receive the basic human dignity they deserved. The revolution was quiet no more. It had become a roar of change that would echo through generations, reminding the world that age brought wisdom, that experience had value, and that every person, regardless of their years, deserved to be treated with respect, dignity, and honor. And in the morning, the work would continue. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.